Now, India is hosting the G20 foreign ministers meeting. Fractured East-West relations over the conflict in Ukraine and increasing concerns about China's global aspirations are set to dominate the meeting. The meeting is particularly crucial for India's hopes to use its chairmanship of the group to leverage its position on the global stage, also to adopt a neutral stance on Ukraine. After a welcome dinner yesterday, the main meetings will be held today, and India wishes to focus on issues of importance to developing nations like rising inflation, debt stress, health, climate change, and food and energy security. However, the split over the invasion of Ukraine and its impact on global energy and food security is predicted to overshadow the proceedings. The antagonism has left G20 host India in the position of trying to reconcile clearly irreconcilable differences. The meeting is being attended by 40 delegations, including those headed by the Russian Foreign Minister, the US Secretary of State, and the Chinese Foreign Minister. Russia says it will use this meet to tell the world who, as per Moscow, is responsible for the political and economic crises. Germany says it will counter Russian propaganda, and the United States has underlined that it is important to call out Moscow. EU says Russia must be made to understand that the war in Ukraine has to end. Lavrov would attend and be seated with delegation from the UAE and East Asian countries. India has declined to blame Moscow for the war, seeking a diplomatic solution, and has boosted its purchase of Russian oil. Remember, India has also abstained from voting in UN resolutions that condemn the Ukraine invasion. Yesterday, Lavrov and India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar held discussions in New Delhi. The meeting is also being watched for how tensions between Washington and Beijing will play out. China has been backing a political solution to the war in Ukraine. Last month, the United States shot down what it said was a Chinese surveillance balloon just off South Carolina after it spent days traveling across the country. The incident widened the diplomatic rift between the two countries. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has no plans to meet the foreign ministers of Russia and China. The British Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, will meet the Chinese Foreign Minister on the sidelines. Cleverly said he will like to support India in having a successful G20 presidency. For more on this, we're now being joined by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal from New Delhi. Siddhant, thank you for joining us. What can you tell us of the agenda for the day?
Well, in almost 1 hour's time, we will see the official opening of the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting here at the Rashtrapati Bhavan, where the foreign ministers will be arriving shortly. And the focus, of course, will be on several things, but it's the shadow of Russia-Ukraine conflict that's dominating the agenda here. We know that when it comes to India's role is being seen as a bridge maker between West and Russia. But the big question is that will there be a joint statement, or will there be a repetition of what we saw at the finance ministers meeting in Bangalore? Now, we know that the Indian Prime Minister also addresses the foreign ministers meeting virtually at around 9 a.m. Indian Standard Time. And of course, he will be focusing on India's priorities like the reform of the United Nations, counter-terrorism, global skill mapping, among other issues. But largely today will be a big diplomatic day for Delhi, because just not the foreign ministers meeting, but also the Italian Prime Minister, who will be shortly arriving here in the Indian national capital.
Right, Siddhant. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen that Russia has taken a strong position and wishes to tell who, as per Moscow, is responsible for the global crises. What can we expect in that regard?
Well, there is a visible shrill or divide between Russia, backed by China, and the West. Of course, we saw in last 24 hours comments by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov here in Delhi, who has been saying that they would like to see the strengthening of the Indian presidency of the grouping. And they have been saying that this is primarily an economic grouping. Well, they are right in several aspects, because the grouping emerged after 2008 financial crisis. But since then, it has taken other roles as well, because the United Nations was found missing. It has been taking strong action in terms of the COVID crisis. There were special emergency meetings of the G20. But essentially, the Western world and the developing countries have been talking about the impact of the conflict, especially in the global south. In fact, the Bangladeshi foreign minister, who has been invited as one of the guest countries, spoke to WION exclusively and talked about how the conflict is impacting the price rise in his country. That is a common story, whether it's Bangladesh or many African countries. So essentially, this divide needs to be bridged, and we will get to know about the final outcome later in the day as the negotiations progress.
Right. Well, Siddhant, thank you so much for getting us all these inputs. We will, of course, continue to track these developments very closely. Moving on, now we're also joined by Richard Rosso from Washington, D.C. Richard is a senior advisor and chair in U.S.-India policy studies at CSIS. Thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast.
Of course.
Now, fractured East-West relations over the conflict in Ukraine, increasing concerns about China's global aspirations is set to dominate the meeting. What do you reckon will be the outcome of this meet?
I think it's going to be an impasse. I think that the difficulty that you had even with the finance ministers, which have a much wider agenda, as you have the foreign ministers coming together, it's going to be a lot more narrowly focused on the pain points that we see right now, particularly Russia, Ukraine, but of course also, as you rightly pointed out, the United States is coming in with fresh concerns about Chinese espionage. So it feels to me like we're headed for a logjam once again. I don't expect any kind of joint statement that'll have any kind of meaning behind it related to this fight.
Right. Now, U.S.-China tensions are also something everyone will be closely watching out for. What can we expect on that front?
Well, I think probably the most notable element is probably what's going to take place after the G20 meeting. The day after the G20 meetings conclude, the Quad foreign ministers are going to get together in Delhi. And the Quad has really become, one of the two primary vehicles that's been emerging along with AUKUS, which is, of course, the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. But the Quad has a real role to play. You've got a leader summit coming up expected in May. So the fact that foreign ministers are getting together alongside the G20 meeting, at the end of the day, that may become the most tangible output from the entire G20 summit, the meetings taking place on the sidelines and after the fact.
Right. Now, Russia is seeking to use this meet, as I mentioned earlier as well, to tell the world who it thinks is responsible for the global crises. What do you make of this?
Well, they've done a pretty good job of spreading what they perceive as their message. That Ukraine's interest in joining NATO has really been the decider for Russia's intention to invade. And a lot of countries around the world, it is they have a soft spot when they hear those kind of messages there. But of course, here in Washington, when you had for the last number of years, Baltic countries and others coming to Washington and talking about these major pressure points that they were feeling, Russian Air Force overflights over their territory, submarines that are popping up right offshore from friendly nations to the United States. The pressure's been there. You've already got an invasion of Georgia, a smaller invasion earlier of Ukraine. So I think Russia is doing a pretty good job on conveying a message. But the proof points show something very, very different.
Right. Now, in terms of food, energy security, climate change, do you reckon the member nations will be able to chart out an effective action plan going forward?
I don't think they will here. I think as we get closer to the Leaders Summit, that'll take place later in the year in Delhi. When you get the leaders together, there's a lot more, I think, impetus to trying to get something on paper. We saw it even in Bali, where they had this, statement where most countries strongly condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So to see that they were able to squeak something out that at least referenced this this invasion, was pretty powerful stuff. But something tells me that where we are right now, it's going to take a leader summit, not a minister summit, I think, to rally the troops and to be able to get any kind of a joint statement together. So for this one, I think less. But later on, as we head toward the Leaders Summit, I think things may sharpen. India's going to want to get to finality on at least something to show for this leadership. So I'm looking as we closer to Leaders Summit on real outcomes to start to gel, not quite so early.
All right. Well, Mr. Rosso, thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast with your insights on this.
Yeah, of course.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.